Hey folks, gonna talk about something that doesn't typically it gets addressed in the textbook, but a lot of times it gets overlooked, unfortunately. And it's a really big, important thing, but and I don't think anybody's trying to hide it or anything. It's just it gets overshadowed by some bigger event, much bigger and more important events, depending on your frame of reference. But we need to talk about it, and you're going to fall asleep, but we need to talk about the post World War II economy. Um, remember, we were leaving World War II, and during World War II, and we addressed this earlier, um, at the tail end of the Great Depression, once we get the New Deal running and employing massive numbers of people, that's helping with the Depression. It is having an influence on it. But ultimately, the biggest thing to wipe out, to end the Great Depression was World War II. You have the United States government spending a tremendous amount of money on research and fielding armies and producing all kinds of war materiel and stuff like that. And the government is spending a gigantic amount of money, and we are at 100% employment, and so that's fantastic as far as the economy going. The war itself was terrible. Ultimately had an ultimate good come out of it, um, but that ultimately stops the depression. Well, there's a concern, and it's going to sound kind of weird, but there's legitimately a concern at the end of World War II that, hey, the war's over. We are mustering large numbers of typically males out of the military. These guys are all going to go home, uh, may or may not have jobs when they get there. Uh, but on the home front, also shutting down a lot of these factories, a lot of these places that are making tanks and jeeps and half tracks and trucks for the military and ships and all that stuff. All that stuff's getting shut down. So there's legit a concern that once you stop production of all that stuff and once lay off effectively most of the military, there's a big concern that the depression is going to start again, and it doesn't. But here's the reason. During the war, and the textbook talks about this a good bit, we as a nation, and other nations are doing this as well, but the United States as a nation, we're not producing civilian goods. We're not making pots and pans or stoves or refrigerators or cars or tires for the most part, for the civilian markets, for their cars even. And we're not making those things for 4 years. And so two things happen, really cool happens, is there's a 4 year deficit of all of these civilian goods. And so if you had a car, if you were really lucky and you had a car that you bought maybe in the early part of the Great Depression, well, if you bought it before the crash, that car's 15 years old now. And there's been a lot of innovation going on in the last 15 years, especially all that military development that will spill over into the civilian market. uh, any of the goods that you've had, you know, if you were lucky, you might have bought them before the Depression. Most nobody's buying a lot of stuff during the Depression. And then during the war years, nobody's buying a lot of stuff. So there's a huge desire to buy a lot of stuff on the civilian market because we haven't had these things. Also, coupled with that, and here's one of the cool, fantastic things. Remember during the war that you know at least by the part where the United States was involved, 4 years during the war, but we were also producing prior to the United States entrance into the war. A lot of the civilian uh, component of society, sorry, they were all working. We had 100% employment there, but they didn't have anything to spend their money on. And so there were a lot of people that were working really hard, and they didn't have anything to spend their money on, so they had basically forced savings account. If you don't have anything to spend your money on, you're just going to sock that money into the bank. So once we get to 1945 and the war is over, you've got this huge desire to purchase new homes, new appliances, new cars, new furniture, all this kind of stuff. And you also very much have the ability, because you have this massive, massive nest egg that you've accumulated over the last 4 years where everything was super, super scarce. And so when the war ends in 1945, there's that concern about that the Great Depression might start again. But a lot of those factories that we've built and developed during the war years to produce all these military goods, they're going to be retooled to the civilian market. And you've got a lot of consumers out there with a tremendous amount of money, and they're going to buy a lot of stuff. And so uh, instead of entering back into a Great Depression, all of that money that the government spent and people have been socking away because they had nothing to spend it on, that's going to be pumped back into the economy. And so we're actually going to have a post-war boom following World War II out of the civilian market. And so we really have this huge amount of post-war affluence. A lot of people are doing pretty well, and there are a lot of people have a lot of money to spend, and that's going to reinvigorate the economy. And so for the next 15, about 15 years really, we're going to have a very solid economy because there's a lot of spending going on, and that desire to buy all this stuff, well, that's going to lead to a lot of people finding employment and producing all of this stuff. And so manufacturing in the United States is going to take a tremendous, tremendous ride, and we're going to, do pretty well. So that's kind of a little snippet on the post-war economy that I really wanted to get into because it often gets overlooked. I mean, there's so many big, huge issues coming out of the war. The war's ended, and that was a tremendously horrible time, and there was a very righteous cause. But then after that, we're quickly entering into the Cold War, and so the economy itself gets kind of glossed over there. And so I felt like we needed to address that a little bit. Thanks.